Hello and welcome to Glad You Asked. My name is Bryn. Today we're considering how it is that we can know when to understand that the Bible is being symbolic or when it is communicating literally. The specific question that was sent in puts it as follows. What is the reasoning for deciding that certain sections of the Bible are symbolic? Now, that's a very important question to ask. When we read the Bible, it's important to know how it is that this thing is communicating to us. Is it literal or is it more figurative and symbolic? Now, one thing that's important to note is that the questioner isn't asking the reasoning behind deciding which sections of the Bible are true and which aren't. Right? Rather, they're acknowledging that the Bible sometimes uses symbolic language to express truth. But how do we know when it's doing that? Now, we do this all the time. In conversation, we use metaphor and idioms to communicate ideas. For example, I might say, Usain Bolt was on fire the other night. Can you believe that amazing time? And you're not going to ask me, is he okay? Were the burns serious? Or I might use an idiom and I might say, my bicycle cost an arm and a leg. And you're not going to look at me and be like, how did you get your limbs back? There are ways that I can express something that's true in more vivid and descriptive language. It's important to make that clear before we go any further. Just because something isn't literal, that doesn't mean it's not true. That principle applies to our day-to-day language, and it applies to the language of the Bible as well. But that doesn't actually answer the question yet. The question is, when confronted with a passage in the Bible, how do we know whether to take it literally or as though it's symbolic? Well, let me just say right off the bat that there's no quick and easy way of being certain in any and every case. There are a number of considerations that we need to take into account in order to determine whether to read something as literal or symbolic. So let's look at a few of these considerations together. The first and perhaps the most important consideration for figuring this out is to think about what genre we're reading. The Bible is full of all kinds of different genres. It has historical narrative, poetry, prose discourse, apocalyptic, proverbs, parables, and legal codes, along with a whole bunch of other things. All these genres have their own quirks. They communicate in different ways. Now, if that seems overwhelming, don't panic. Figuring out what genre we're reading isn't too difficult if we're used to the kind of language that the Bible uses. We're all very familiar with the principle, at least, of figuring out what genre we're reading at a given time and using that to interpret it. For example, if you pick up a newspaper, you are going to expect a particular style of writing. You expect it's reporting facts in a rather literal way. On the other hand, if you pick up a book and it starts with a sentence, "Once upon a time in a land far away, there lived a girl," you're going to have a completely different set of expectations going into that. Or imagine you read love poetry. You'd need to adjust your thinking yet again to understand this is speaking to you in a different way to how the newspaper article or the fairy tale were speaking to you. The same thing's true of the Bible. We need to pay attention to the genre in order to understand if a passage is literal or symbolic. There are some genres that communicate in a literal way the vast majority of the time. For example, historical narrative. And this also happens to be the genre that is most prevalent in the Bible. What can sometimes be tricky, though, is that in the Bible you have genre switches within a single book. Books that are predominantly narrative have other genres mixed in with them. Take Genesis. It contains historical narrative for the most part, but it also contains poetry. So if we look at the blessings that Jacob pronounces on his sons at the end of his life in Genesis chapter 49, we get this long poem that's sandwiched within historical narrative on either side. We know this because the poem features all the hallmarks of Hebrew poetry. It has parallel lines, that's the main thing. But I also point to this particular passage because it has some symbolic language, as does a lot of poetry in the Bible. Have a look with me at this one portion in verse 10 of Jacob's blessing over his son Judah. It says, "The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nations shall be his." So we see in those first two poetic lines this image of a scepter or a ruler's staff. Now, it's not saying Judah is literally never going to let go of his staff, but it's pointing to the fact that Judah's line will have kings in it. The scepter is a symbol of royal rule. We'd know that even if it didn't say ruler's staff, just knowing it's a scepter would give us that information. Well, how do we know that a scepter symbolizes royal rule? Well, that brings us to our second consideration in determining whether to read something as symbolic or literal. And that is cultural associations or symbols. Now, we know what the scepter represents because that was a common association or symbolic meaning that scepters had in ancient Israel and in their surrounding culture. Every single culture actually has their own cultural associations with certain objects. Things have symbolic value. So if you imagine a bald eagle, chances are you think about the United States. And sticking to birds, owls, for some reason, are often associated with wisdom, at least in my context. But if you were a Native American, chances are you'd associate owls with death. We all have these associations and we just take them for granted. Israel in the Bible has their own culture, their own sets of associations with objects. So if you were an ancient Israelite and you thought about the stars in the sky, you'd think about angels. Or if you have honey, you associate that with abundance. Or for Israelites, beasts or wild animals are associated with the kingdoms of this world. These objects that are loaded with symbolic value are all over the Bible, especially in genres that don't communicate in literal ways. Stuff like poetry, parables, and apocalyptic literature. Note again, because this is important, just because something isn't literal, that doesn't mean it's not communicating something true, and very often something incredibly important. But let's consider an example where we as the readers of the Bible are expected to make a connection between an object and the thing that it symbolizes. So in Matthew 21, Jesus tells a parable, which is just a fictional story to make a point. And the one he tells here is about a landowner who plants a vineyard. Now this landowner takes good care of his vineyard. He builds a wall around it to protect it from wild animals. And then he rents out this land to some tenants for them to take care of. But when the landowner sends some other servants to go and collect his portion of the harvest that is owed him by the tenants get violent and they beat the servants and kill some of them. So the landowner sends more servants to go and collect his portion, and the tenants treat them in the same way. Let's read in the story itself from verse 37. "Last of all, he, that is the landowner, sent his son to them. 'They will respect my son,' he said. But when the tenants saw the son, they said to each other, 'This is the heir. Come, let's kill him and take his inheritance.' So they took him and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him." And so Jesus asks those listening this question. "Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants?" "He will bring those wretches to a wretched end," they replied. "And he will rent the vineyard to other tenants, who will give him his share of the crop at harvest time." See, at the end of all this, we're told that the chief priests and the Pharisees who were listening to these parables understood that the parables were about them, and so they looked for a way to arrest Jesus. The thing about this parable is it's talking all about Israel's leaders who have rejected their duty to God, and at every attempt of God to correct them by sending messengers to come and call them to obey, that results in the beating of said messengers and sometimes the killing of them. And what's more, it's now going to lead to the death of God's Son. But the thing is, we only realize that full meaning of it, we only understand it, if we realize that the vineyard symbolizes God's people, Israel. Well, how are we supposed to know what something symbolizes? Sometimes we're going to need to look at research about ancient culture to find these things out. I'm not going to lie to you. Sometimes you need to go out of the Bible and look for it. But most of the time, we figure it out by looking at the Bible itself. You see, if we're familiar with the Old Testament, then when Jesus says vineyard, we'd immediately think of Israel. The prophets spoke about Israel as being God's vineyard. And in fact, this parable is very similar to one recorded for us in Isaiah chapter 5. And that brings us to our final big consideration when determining whether a passage is to be understood as literal or symbolic. And that consideration is context. All context is the stuff written before and after the thing we're reading. It might come right before or right after your passage, or it can come long before or long after your passage. Most of the time, the information we need to tell if something is literal or symbolic is right there. It's part of the passage that you're actually reading. But sometimes it comes from other parts of the Bible, and you'll need to know that to have the tools to understand it. Often with passages in the Bible, as I say, we can tell immediately that we're not supposed to take it literally just by reading a few verses around it. Take, for example, Daniel chapter 7. It's written in a genre called apocalyptic literature. There we're told Daniel has this dream, and it's filled with these weird-looking beasts that come up out of the sea. And then as we read on in the same chapter, Daniel is given the interpretation for this dream. See, these beasts represent kings or kingdoms that will rise to power. So it's clear that the stuff about the beasts symbolize something. They symbolize something that is true, but the kings and kingdoms themselves are not literal beasts. Similarly, in Mark chapter 4, Jesus tells the parable of the sower. It's one of his most famous parables. And it communicates in a symbolic way, but his disciples don't get it. So they ask Jesus, what was that all about? And then he gives us an interpretation and in detail goes through what everything in the parable symbolizes. Now, of course, it's not always as simple as reading the rest of the passage. Sometimes we're going to need to know stuff, and very often I'd say we need to know stuff from other parts of the Bible in order to know whether what's going on is literal or symbolic. Knowing the Bible well, particularly the narrative stuff, the whole Bible storyline from creation to new creation, really is the best way to figure this kind of thing out. I say that because there are often ideas repeated across stories and across biblical genres, both the literal and the non-literal stuff. So for example, if you read Exodus chapter 14, you get the historical narrative account of Israel crossing the Red Sea. And as you read on to chapter 15, you get a song that's written as poetry, which describes the same event, but in a completely different genre. Both describe something that's real, but they do it in very different ways. Knowing the storyline behind the poem helps you to ground your understanding of what the poem's saying. Now, a lot of figurative and symbolic language in the Bible relates back to earlier stuff. In fact, most of it relates back to earlier stuff in the more literal narrative sections. It will do you the world of good to know the narrative well and to let that shape your understanding of the other stuff that can be a bit more confusing for us, because they're written in genres that are unfamiliar to us. They're not the kind of things we're used to. Well, there's a lot more that could be said on this topic, but let's leave it there in terms of method. As an answer to the question, one sentence, it's not always easy to tell if stuff is literal or symbolic, but most of the time it is. I've put a link to a very helpful playlist of videos from the Bible Project. It's a series called How to Read the Bible. It's incredibly helpful for getting your bearings in unfamiliar genres and also just reminding you of good practices that can help you be a better reader of the Bible. And I want to close by saying that it's actually a good thing that the Bible is packed with symbolism. Symbols and metaphors help ideas to stick in our minds. Not only that, some things would be incomprehensible for us if they weren't explained using images and concepts that we're more familiar with. And so we get a richer understanding of God as we can engage with His Word in a variety of ways that stretch our minds and that appeal to our emotions as well. So rather than getting frustrated, remember that these things aren't written to confuse, rather to shape our minds, to force us to think long and hard about them. And in doing so, we get to know the God behind the Bible better and better. I trust that's a helpful start on this topic. Please feel free to come back at me if you have questions. You can do that in the comments section below. Goodbye and God bless.